Okay, so welcome to my next talk on Elisha. This is number 6 in the series on Elisha. I've got one or two, maybe more to go. I'm not quite sure how many we'll do, but anyway. So I don't know whether sometimes people either love or hate theme parks. I don't know whether you're a lover of theme parks. I have to confess that I'm not. It's like Marmite, you either love them or hate them. Some people will love them and they love going on roller coasters and all the rest of it. I think the time I realised it was probably time to stop was one occasion, just going back a bit, I was on a roller coaster and the sort of force of gravity shot my glasses off. But fortunately I managed to catch them, which I thought was quite impressive. But I thought after that I'm not doing this anymore. So I think that's probably the last time I've been on a roller coaster, which is, we still have the kids with us at home, so it's some time ago. Anyway, and to quote Ronan Keating, someone else I never thought I would quote either, life is a roller coaster sometimes. And in the story we're going to look at this morning, we'll see that life is definitely a bit of a roller coaster. So let's do the reading. So this is moving on to in chapter 4 of 2 Kings from the story we did last time about the woman with her oil miracle. This follows straight on after that. One day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God." So she doesn't seem to know too much about Elisha's reputation, but she senses that he's a man of God. "Let's make a small room on the roof and put a bed in it, and a table and a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." So she does a bit of a house extension. They had flat roofs, so they could build on top. One day when Elisha came, he went up to his room and lay down there. He said to his servant Gehazi, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her, and she stood before him. Elisha said to him, "Tell her, you have gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?" And she replied, "I have a home among my own people." "What can be done for her?" Elisha asked. Gehazi said, "Well, she has no son, and her husband is old." Then Elisha said, "Call her." So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. "About this time next year," Elisha said, "you will hold a son in your arms." "No, my lord," she objected. "Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about the same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. And the child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers. So it was harvest time. And he said to his father, "My head, my head." And his father told a servant, "Carry him to his mother." After the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and then shut the door and went out. She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the servants and a donkey, so that I can go to the man of God quickly and return." "Why go to him today?" he asked. "It's not the new moon or the Sabbath." "That's all right," she said. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Lead on, and don't slow down for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. It's about some 15 miles away. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, there's the Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?' 'Everything is all right,' she said. When she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. And Gehazi came over to push her away. But the man of God said, 'Leave her alone. She is in bitter distress. But the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why.' 'Did I ask you for a son, my lord?' she said. 'Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?' And Elisha said to Gehazi, 'Tuck your cloak into your belt. Take my staff in your hand and run. Don't greet anyone you meet. And if anyone greets you, don't answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face.' But the child's mother said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So he got up and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him the boy is not awakened. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. And as he stretched himself out on him, the boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out on him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. I just wonder whether it was right in the face of Elisha. I don't know. But anyway, a bit of a shock if it was. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." And he did. And when he came, he said, "Take your son." She came in, fell at his feet and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. So you see now why Life is a Roller Coaster is an apt title for this particular tour. So I've just a few things, as always, a few musings to bring out from the story. The first is what I've called hospitality in the little things. This all comes about, this story, because of her offer of hospitality. Now, I know that was a thing in their culture particularly, but it says in the start of the story that she had to sort of persuade him a bit to come and stay. So she's quite persistent, come and stay, have a meal with us, and then it kind of develops from there. Hospitality is a key thing in the kingdom work. I just want to remind you of that. It's a very simple point, really, but it is important. And you know what the shortest command in the New Testament is? You remember, I did this in a talk a little while ago in Romans. Romans 12:13, practice hospitality. It's just 2 words, very simple. Practice hospitality. And in our culture, we need reminding of that because we don't often like to practice hospitality as much as they did in Israel in that time. We're often very nervous about opening our homes up to other people and just, making it a place of welcome and hospitality. But it is kingdom work, as Paul reminded the church in Rome. It is kingdom work. So I just want to just leave that with you. Just think about how you can use your house and your assets to practice hospitality. Some of you do that, I know already very well, so it's great. And I need reminding sometimes, that my home isn't just mine. It's something I steward for God and for the kingdom. The second thing why I've called it the little things is that there's a bit of a chain of events that goes on in this story. And one thing kind of leads to another. A very small thing, this woman saying to Elisha, "Come and have a meal," leads on to other things. First of all, it's just a simple act of kindness, and that's great. But it then forms into an ongoing friendship and relationship, as every time that Elisha's in that region, he goes and stays with her. And it becomes a kind of her provision of ministry to him. The provision of this little room that they build on top of the house for Elisha to stay in. And eventually, because of that, because Elisha wants to bless her, it ends up in the gift of life for her, in the provision of the son in the story. So what became a very small thing, in God's hands, small act of kindness, come and have a meal, ends up with the blessing of the birth of a child in their old age and the miracle that it is. So I just want to remind you of that sometimes just a small thing that you do for God in the kingdom has ripple effects that work out, and you never quite know what he's going to do. One small conversation, one act of kindness can just be multiplied by God in the kingdom to work something wonderful out. So never be afraid of those small acts of kindness, whether it's with neighbours or friends or family or whatever, because you never quite know what God's going to do with it and how it may end up. Then, of course, we have the miracle of the birth. Elisha wants to bless this woman, and he asks his servant, what can we do for this woman? Do you think? How can we bless her? And he says, can I speak to? He's got connections now. He's well known in the nation. So he says, can I speak to the king or the commander of the army? I don't quite know what he thinks they might do for her, but might give her some gift or some influence or power or something. But she says, no, I'm quite happy, with my family and my friends. That I'm happy in life. I don't need any blessing from the king or power or influence. I'm not interested in all of that. And then Gehazi comes up with this idea. Well, she hasn't got a son. Now it's a bit obscure as to whether she'd had other children, i.e. daughters, but she may or may not have. But in any case, she hasn't had what was the key prize blessing in that culture of a son and an heir. And so Elisha says, this time next year, you'll have a son. And it's interesting that how this resonates with the Abraham story of chapter 18 in Genesis. It's like a rerun of it in some ways. And in the same way that when God says to Sarah, Abraham's wife, you're going to have a son, she laughs and says, don't be ridiculous, I'm too old. And she says, no, don't mislead me. My husband and I, she doesn't actually say this, but my husband and I are too old for this, It's not going to happen. It'd be a miracle. But of course, miracles can happen with God. And it's interesting that the phrase that Elisha uses when he says, you'll have a son this time next year, is only used twice in the Bible, and the other time is in Genesis 18 with Sarah. So there's these little things that hint back to the story. And this is kind of a pattern in the Bible. You'll notice this with husbands and wives that apparently can't conceive. And Abraham's one with Sarah, and they have Isaac, and then Isaac and Rebekah can't conceive for 20 years, and then eventually Esau and Jacob come about. And Rachel, Jacob's favourite wife, can't conceive, and he has children by the concubines and all the rest of it. But then eventually, Joseph is born. Manoah can't conceive, and then Samson's born. And Hannah pleads, she goes and pleads with God for a child, and Samuel's born. And then in the New Testament, there's Elizabeth with John the Baptist. So it's a theme that God works in barren situations to bring life, and he seems to enjoy doing that, and it's an amazing thing, and he does that in this story. And in those other conceptions, in some ways they always end up with either people who are very important in the Bible, leaders or patriarchs or prophets or whatever, but we know nothing of the future of this particular child. He doesn't seem to do anything particularly, but nevertheless there's this grace. Even when she doesn't believe, God's grace comes upon her. So I think God does delight in birthing things. And that can work in lots of different situations, not just literally with kids, but he does that sometimes too. But often it can be spiritual, or with dreams or ministries or projects or callings. So often we seem to be in a position of barrenness. And it's in that time when we've been longing for something for some time, and then he suddenly births it. So God is something of a midwife, really. He just loves that time of birth, particularly when it's a special blessing kind of birth. So, and sometimes we feel in our own lives that spiritually or whatever, that things are a bit barren. But don't despair. God may just do something. He may bring life unexpectedly, because he delights to do that. Okay, so we move on in the story after the miracle birth. Okay, I've forgotten to click those. So we then come on to the roller coaster, where sometime later he's obviously grown up, this child, but we don't know how old he is, but he's young enough to be carried, probably 9 or 10, something like that, 10 or 11 maybe. Old enough to go out and follow his father as they're bringing in the harvest and get involved in that. Obviously the parents, it suggests, are quite well to do. They obviously own land and have servants and all the rest of it. So he goes out and he's in the fields and suddenly starts to feel ill, falls ill, and gets carried to his mother. very quickly, it seems, only for, by midday, as he's been standing or sitting on the lap of his mother, he's dead. I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, what you can just sense a sense of feeling and sympathy with this woman who, and as she said when she finally reaches Elisha, she says, "I didn't ask for this," that kind of thing. I was kind of worried that this might happen or something, and then, it all works out in the end. But nevertheless, this woman has an amazing faith through this roller coaster of life and these events that happen. And there's you sense a trust that it's not over with God. That even though the child has died, she doesn't kind of get him ready for burial or anything like that. She goes and lays him on the bed of Elisha's little room that they've created. And that's an act of faith. Although she perhaps can't see what God's going to do, she's kind of hanging on and saying, I don't think this is over. I don't think this is the end. She also keeps it from her husband. Although the husband's been out in the fields and knew that the child had become ill, he doesn't seem to be aware of the fact that the child has then died. And the woman, the mother, doesn't say anything to him. Or she says, I need to go and see Elisha. And he kind of says, why? It's not the Sabbath or the new moon. It's not kind of a special time when you might go and consult a prophet or something. So she keeps it from her husband and just says it's all right, even though it's not. It's interesting that phrase that she uses, "it's all right," is the term shalom. It's shalom, she says. It's everything's in harmony. It's all right. And she says that same thing to Gehazi when he asks what's the servant, what's wrong. And yet she is distressed, as we know. She's distressed, but she also seems to have some faith that it's going to be all right. And she has this mixture of distress and shalom together. And also she's clinging on. She's clinging on to God. It's interesting that, when she eventually gets to Elisha on the mountain, it says that she clings to him. She clings to his feet. And Gehazi, the servant, comes along and sort of tries to shoo her off and says, "What are you doing?" To the man of God. Get off. It just reminds me of that Jesus story when the disciples try and shoo the kids off, But no. Elisha says, "Look, she's in distress. Can't you see?" So she's clinging on to God. And that's really what we do in the roller coaster. Sometimes all we can do is just cling on, trusting that God will work in some way that we can't yet see, and work his life into a situation. And often in those times of difficulty and trouble, that's all we can do. All we can do is just cling on, as she clings on to the man of God as God's representative. But we cling on to Jesus. So the story reminds us that we aren't immune to life's difficulties and life's trials and life's troubles. We just aren't. The Bible never promises that. I know there are some streams of faith that kind of hint that way, that if you just have enough faith, then nothing bad will ever happen. That's rubbish. It's not true. The Bible never promises that. We aren't immune to the trials and the difficulties, but what we do have, a promise that God is always in it with us. He never abandons us. We're not immune, but we're not alone. We're not alone. Okay. Then we have just something about Elisha's response to all of this. It's quite interesting that, well, for one thing, he hasn't seen this coming. He's kind of the seer, the prophet, who sees everything, usually, that other people can't see. But he's not seen this. And he says, God's hidden this from me. I can see she's in distress, but I don't know why. And that reminds me that, there is, even to the most gifted of people, there are limits to our powers. And sometimes God just does hide things from us because he's working his purposes out in a different way that we don't need to know. And sometimes we don't know what's happening in perfection. It's like the dim image in a mirror that Paul says. All of us need to remember that. We don't see things perfectly. And often we can make judgments without seeing perfectly. And so I try to keep my options and my mind open to what God might be doing, even when I can't understand it or see it, as even Elisha couldn't at this particular moment. I don't know, but yeah, so it's hidden. And then he first of all suggests, well, let's try this, my staff, my staff, which often has held the power of God. So he says, I get the impression that by this stage Elisha's getting on in years a little bit, so he's a bit slower. Gehazi's probably in his 20s, I think, and he thinks, let's get Gehazi running off because he's quicker than me with speed, and take the staff and lay the staff on the child and see if God uses that. So and that doesn't work. So he's not even able to sense immediately what God's really doing. He's kind of almost trying things and seeing what works. But the power isn't in this. On this occasion, the power isn't in the staff. So that doesn't work. And eventually, Elisha's getting there slower and eventually gets there. And Gehazi comes back and meets him on the way and says, it's not worked. The child still hasn't responded. And then what happens is he does this laying on business, which sounds a bit weird to us, but it may be because Elijah, his protege, or his mentor, originally did a similar miracle where he laid on someone three times. It took him when he laid, and they were revived. And so he does this power of touch. Now this is a biblical thing, the power of touch. You see it with Elijah, you see it here. You see it with Paul when he raises someone from the dead. He goes and it described it in Acts as he puts his arms around someone who'd fall out of the window while he was preaching. Dangerous thing, preaching. And then of course Jesus often touched when he was praying or reviving someone. So there is, and this is a mystery, but it's because we have the Holy Spirit within us that physically often we're able to transfer something of the power of God as we're guided by him towards other people. That's why we do laying on of hands sometimes when we pray. Not always. It's not something that's magic or always works, but often it is, and we seek the Holy Spirit's guidance as to when we lay hands on people or touch people, and we always want to do that properly and sensitively, and we ask permission to do that where it's appropriate. So I just want to remind you about that's why we do laying on of hands, because there is this something about the presence and power of God that physically, mysteriously can transfer between one person and another for God's work. And I sense probably there is an ebb and flow about that as well. That sometimes, perhaps that's to do with our own personal walk with God, that how close we are with him, has something to do with how much power is within us, how much room we're making for the Holy Spirit in our lives. And lastly, I think in terms of Elisha's response, there is just a sense of persistence. He has to do this twice, and in between he wanders around the room and is praying. And eventually, of course, the miracle happens and life comes. So all of those things are important in ministry, the hiddenness, trying things sometimes that doesn't work, and power from within and persistence. Okay, and then we come on finally, and this story has to be about this, that the kingdom has power over death. Ultimately, it does. So this is a story that is pointing to Jesus and pointing to his power and the empty tomb. And it's really interesting, actually, that as I was reading up on this story, that Shunem, the place where Elisha's miracle took place, is about 2 miles away from Nain. Now, if you know your stories of Jesus in Luke's Gospel, you know that's the place where he raised a child from the dead who was being carried on a stretcher to be buried. And Jesus turns up and raises him from the dead. And apparently it was just the next little village on. So I wonder whether those people in Nain were thinking, oh, this is like what Elisha did in Shunem, a couple of miles away. So there's definitely a link pointing to Jesus and pointing to the kingdom power over death and the empty tomb. And that's part of what the kingdom is doing, is defeating the power of death. this is Jesus when he raised Lazarus from the dead. He said to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And she says, "Yes, Lord, I believe you are the resurrection and the life." That's our promise to us as believers, that the power of death, the sting of death, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians, has been beaten by the power of God. Now, we all will die physically. That's not what that promise means, unless he comes again before we do. But it does mean that even through death, we pass through it and we are raised again, and with Jesus in his presence. So in that sense, we can be, although it's a prospect that is fearful in one sense, it's something we can approach with confidence in Jesus, because he was raised. So as he was raised, so we will be raised on the last day. I thought in closing that when we did the Easter Sunday story, I had a quote from a lady writer, Christian writer called L.R. Knost. You might remember it. And I thought it was worth using it again and closing with this, because it just fits in with that kind of roller coaster of the story. Life is amazing, and then it's awful. And then it's amazing again. And in between the amazing and awful, it's ordinary and mundane and routine. Breathe in the amazing, hold on through the awful. Relax and exhale during the ordinary. That's just living. Heartbreaking, soul healing, amazing, ordinary, awful, ordinary life, and it's breathtakingly beautiful. And one day, God will make all things new. And that's all of that stuff that is the downside of that quote, and it will be gone forever. And he will make all things good. And that's what we believe in trust. Sometimes when, as I sing that song that we sang at the end, I have to sing it in faith, not seeing, because I don't see all things good, but I trust that it will be one day all good, because he will make all things new. I think I'm done. I've gone over time, so I'll stop it.